Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be re-reviewing the Paldea Evolved set. We've had the two big tournaments of the year for Paldea Evolved, and now we will be moving into the Obsidian Flames expansion. So it's always nice to look back, see what we got right and wrong during our review, as well as looking towards these cards now with the foresight of the newer cards coming out from Obsidian Flames. So let's get into it. I'm going to be popping up on your screen there, hello, and we're going to start off with the easiest gimme out there. Literally everyone said that Iono was going to be a top tier card, and it certainly is, and will continue to be, you know, one of the faces of all of our supporter engines, and continues to just be a really impactful card that everyone has to respect and either add in draw power Pokemon throughout, or just know that if you are playing an aggressive deck that you're sometimes just going to fall prey to an Iono sticking, and if you don't have some onboard presence you can just end up giving up 4 prizes even if you've gone ahead 4 prizes and end up losing the game. So yeah, something to bear in mind. This will never change. Then we have Giacomo. It's a pretty interesting one. This actually saw play in the highest placing Rapid Strike deck alongside Spiritomb, and that was possibly something that was maybe a little bit overlooked. You can see that I have the Mew VMAX on the screen here, but seeing this support alongside Spiritomb actually gives you a more defensive, coherent package against Mew in general. So possibly having this as a sort of more general counter to just fusion energy builds of Mew can allow maybe some otherwise very vulnerable decks like the Rapid Strike toolbox to actually have a win condition there. So possibly a little bit underrated, but this didn't see play like in any deck except for exactly this Rapid Strike box. So I think 2 is fairly reasonable, but I do think it's correct in Urshi going forward, which still seems to be a pretty powerful deck, by the way. Clavel, obviously terrible. Dendra, terrible. Faulkner, terrible. Grosha, terrible. Yeah, terrible. We then have Super Rod, yes, obvious 5-star card. A game changer for Lost Zone box decks, Gardevoir decks. Chien-Pao was obviously playing this as well. Yeah, just super important card. Again, this was one that pretty much everyone had accepted was going to be a big upgrade to the supporter options only that we had in the format for a little while. Superior, we actually gave this a 5-star rating, thinking that Chien-Pao Baxcalibur was going to be a top-tier deck. Now, even though it didn't necessarily flop the NAIC in the World Championships, I think I'd be hesitant to call Chien-Pao like a very top-tier deck. It's probably like a tier 2 deck. I think it has a good outlook for the future, but I think it's probably more reasonable to put Superior as a 4-star card in the Paldea Evolved format. Chien-Pao Baxcalibur, not necessarily the most consistent archetype, a little bit vulnerable to Path to the Peak, a little bit vulnerable to hand disruption here and there, and just wasn't the most like concrete archetype, and possibly even the Palkia Chien-Pao was the stronger deck to build around Chien-Pao in the first place, and that one didn't need Superior, so I think we dropped this down to a 4-star, but I'm actually very happy to see Chien-Pao Baxcalibur growing in popularity and having more reason to see play in Obsidian Flames if Charizard really becomes a big threat in the metagame. Having an archetype like this, which is probably fast out of the gate and has that explosive one-hit KO potential, you should have a pretty good time into Zard. So I think we're already starting to see that, the sort of pick-up in play rate of Chien-Pao Baxcalibur, and I think that's going to continue. So I feel like this deck will have a better standing in the format so long as Charizard actually hits the ground running. Delivery Drone, obviously terrible. A lot of these are obvious poor cards. The Charm of Courage, I think it found its way into the Miraidons much more than the Chien-Paos. Obviously the Drifloon combo was all smoke and no fire. But yeah, I think we probably dropped this down to like a 3-star, as like probably included in most Miraidons, but not in all of them. And I don't think there's many new cards from the new set that make me think that Charm is going to see much more play. The only upside is that we have the new Town Store Stadium, so there could be some of these decks that have a wide array of tool cards, and the Charm of Courage becomes a 1 copy. Arton Stadium, we gave a 5-star. Pretty contentious, but I do think it found its way into enough Gardevoirs, enough Lost Boxes, because the highest placing Lost Box at the World Championships did play double Artisan rather than playing Pokestops, and it didn't really help out Control, but I did want to give it some credence as a card that can help out get things set up. So I think even though it was like a 1 count / 2 count in some of these archetypes at most, I still feel like it had a profound impact on the meta, and I think this will also be a go-to stadium card for that Charizard archetype to help get early Charmanders as well as Pidgeys or Bidoofs or whatever else into play early whilst providing stadium bounce. So I think it will continue to sort of fit that role and be a very much a go-to stadium card for setup-based archetypes. Calamitous Mountain, obviously poor. Wasteland, obviously terrible. all of these stadiums were pretty poor. Jet Energy, the 5-star treatment, I think is also pretty fair. It basically was single-handedly picking up Giratina from kind of like the depths of tier 2.5 up to tier 1. And I think the Jet Energy opened up the space for you to play Path of the Peak, which gave Tina this extra dimension, whilst also just helping Tina in general race and take full advantage of its Abyss-seeking attack. So it really changed how you would play Giratina and also opened up more defensive lines in the deck. So I think for that alone it's worth the 5-star treatment, but also we did see that, I think it was in the seniors division, a colourless build of Lugia was either in the finals or one, I can't remember now, but a colourless build utilising Jet Energy, and even the single strike builds would possibly play like 2 copies of Jet in most of their builds. So a guaranteed card in Lugia, a guaranteed card in Giratina. Both of these are like top tier archetypes, so I think it's pretty obvious that Jet is going to be continuing to see a huge amount of play. I don't think, again, there's too many archetypes that want to add this in, but I think it's really viable in the decks that are already playing it. Reversal Energy also getting that 5-star treatment. I think that's pretty fair, to be honest with you. Gardevoir did have a huge injection of power by being able to play this card toward getting second place at the World Championships with 2 copies in the deck list. And it just really showing itself to be so important for allowing you to uptrade with this Shiny Arcana Gardevoir. Yes, the sort of Luxray package was kind of a flop, and the sort of quad reversal Gardevoir that we were anticipating heading into the Paldea format really did flop in comparison. But I feel like it did well enough in some of the most high-profile decks, just the regular Gardevoir in general, pretty much the only archetype taking advantage of this, but I think that's enough, right? It was what pushed Gardevoir from being like a pretty okay sort of tier 1.52 deck in the Scarvi meta to then being like probably in a vacuum the most powerful 60 cards you could be playing, and then it just became a question of the metagame that Gardevoir was having to face. And even in that instance, this card helps out against Lost Box, which was pretty much the foil to this deck in general, what most people expected. So yeah, Reversal being most notably like a 2 count, and I think going forward probably a staple 2 count in Guardi sounds pretty good to me. Luminous Energy, we rated a 3-star, probably a little bit high. It didn't really make its way into any of these Lugia-based decks, trying to weave in the Charizard once again. I think we just stuck with a single strike build more often than not, and the Lost Box players also didn't really go for the sort of wide array of attackers so much that was kind of like weakness toolboxes. I think those sorts of approaches were just too vulnerable to Iono in general, so I feel like there wasn't really much of a home for this card. I have started to experiment with Luminous again, actually, in Lost Box, surprisingly enough, and that's because of the new Scizor Stage 1 card, just because it's another single energy attachment attacker, and I think you could easily create a Lost Box deck that wants to play Luminous for that reason. But I still think this is going to remain on that sort of experimental side of things, so probably around that sort of 2 to 3 star going forwards, I would say. We rated Therapy Energy a little bit cautiously, just the 3-star rating, and I feel like that's really how things shaped up. The Snorlax build of Lugia was kind of just not ever that playable in the masses, just because of that fear of Duraludon in the tournaments that we actually were able to play this archetype. So even though it was very good for Snorlax, it was kind of limited in its usage, and yeah, we pretty much had to stick with Single Strike for the majority of the time, and Therapy doesn't make it into that build, so you could even say that this goes lower in play rate. But the one thing I will say is that Duraludon is probably going to be coming out of these Arc decks in favour of Grass stuff, just to help out against Charizard matchup. So that could open the door for Lugia to once again play a full colourless build and not have to worry about having Duraludon wall breaking. So maybe a nod to Snorlax builds from then on. So overall, doing pretty well on the trainers actually. Maybe a little bit higher of a rating on the Superior. But other than that, looking pretty solid overall. So for Chien-Pao, Baxcalibur, we rated these both sort of a 5-star archetype combined. I feel like I was saying with the Superior, it kind of just fell below that threshold a little bit. It was probably more towards a tier 2 deck, but that's not to say it wasn't powerful. I'm pretty much knocking on the door of a lot of the combo pieces here with the VIP pass, the Irida, obviously Greninja coming in. Palkia was the sort of main one that I was looking at the entire time, but there were plenty of builds that were just playing Arc. The other sort of single prize attackers didn't really work out in the end. Skater Spark also played second fiddle to the likes of Pokestop and Lost City as well. But I think we got a number of things right here about the Chien-Pao, and maybe splitting hairs a little bit between that 4 and 5-star rating, whether some people may say it was within the top 5 strongest decks and whatnot, but I think it fell a little bit short of that. But I'm optimistic that this archetype has better placing going into the next set. Squawkabilly EX, we also gave that 4-star, mostly just for its like well-roundedness, I suppose, and I think that's why you'll see a number of people in the community giving that full 5-star rating. but it turned out that it didn't actually make it into a number of these archetypes. Like, sure, it made it into a decent amount of Lugias, but really not all of them. And then no other archetype really backed the Squawk too often. Arc decks, even though you would like to have this extra push potential, oftentimes your search would just have to be the basic in the first place, and you don't also want to have that vulnerable 2-prize liability on your board. That's oftentimes why you won't see Arc decks play Luminion, for example, and the same thing can be said with the Squawk here and there. So I think because Tinglu flopped, because the Wings of Union deck wasn't all that powerful, and Lugia was only like a maybe card, I think you can even drop this down to like 3-star. I feel like it could still be a decent option. It still has that energy acceleration option for certain awkward attackers, similar to how we've seen the Gita supporter turn up in the newest set, but because this Squawk isn't doing too much, it doesn't make me all that confident about Gita as a supporter in general. So probably going to stick as that like maybe can be card that doesn't make it into the majority of lists, I would say. So more likely towards that 3-star rating, but because of its versatility, I think 4 was a decent place to put this. Tinglu at 3-star I think is relatively fair. Like, maybe it's just sort of on those fringes, but in at least online tournaments throughout July, it was sort of like that 12th or 13th best deck, and I think that's pretty fair to say about this archetype. It has disruption at its side, it fairly consistently got set up in the game, and at least asked questions of archetypes and tried to throw hand disruption in the mix, and that's where its really wins came from. I think this should actually be pretty okay against Charizard as well, which will be interesting to see, whether or not that gives any credence to Tinglu going into the future. I don't necessarily think it should though, so I think it's going to stick around this sort of range more than likely. There is of course Glamora as well, so possibly another fighting type archetype sort of takes the lead. Glamora being disruptive in its own rights, just having that bench limiting process. Don't necessarily think Glamora needs something like Koraidon, so maybe it's just a new age build of fighting that sort of overshadows Tinglu in the end. The meme of Meowscarada, yeah, certainly a card that people experimented with and tried out. I think this card was terrible the entire time. But yeah, I think 2-star rating for the Paldea format is pretty much bang on because people did experiment with this deck, mostly alongside that arc just to help you get those candies going. Maybe there's some reason to look at this card again because it actually is strong into Charizard, you would think, as well as having that spread pressure against Lost Zone engines. So unironically, it's a card that we actually have to look at again with a fresh pair of eyes and say that maybe there's reasons to see this archetype see some play. But in the Paldea format, that certainly wasn't, but it could end up being like a decent rogue going into the next metagame. It still seems like it's probably going to be a lot of work and is not going to be the most consistent deck in the room, but there are reasons to actually look at this Meowscarada going ahead. The Tinkaton deck, yeah, also too high maintenance overall. I was definitely scratching my head as to how we could get as much draw power crammed into one deck as possible, but in the end, it's just not going to be a fast enough deck in the game, especially with hand disruption being in pretty much every archetype. Clopperaja we gave the 2-star, even though its stats were absolutely stupid, and it was essentially what we agreed on, was that it was going to be too difficult to power up, or just not worth the payoff, eventually, especially with that Nosequake having the downside of dealing 30 to your own bench, that the fact that you're using this tank and it's sitting around on the board, you're actually then knocking out some of your supporting Pokemon, or at least putting them into range, which makes it harder for you to chain the attack, which is the whole idea of having a tank just sat there announcing the same thing over and over again. But there's downsides of its attacking threat, so yeah, I think we've got it pretty much spot on for Clopperaja. Pretty glamorous card, but again, too much work right now. Noivern EX at that 2-star. I think we did see at the NEIC an Arc Drago deck actually perform pretty well in the lower age divisions, so maybe a nod towards that, maybe a 3-star rating. I still think Arc Drago was basically just a meme archetype that was too much work compared to Arc Tina, and we didn't really see any success for this deck at the World Championships or the Masters Division. Maybe I think there was one Day 2 placement, but not all that high. And yes, there was a big selling point for these combination of attacks from a Noivern, but unfortunately Arc Drago was still missing pieces here and there to actually viably start using that Apex Dragon quickly enough and really setting your stall out. So I still feel like this was certainly a lower tier archetype, possibly worth the 3-star rating just for the highlight of the NEIC, but didn't really impress at Worlds. Fortress, we gave that 1-star, and I think that's pretty fair, honestly. The hype died down after like 1 or 2 days on Fortress, and I think that's pretty fair. Yes, there is Toadscruel in the new set that could try and use this as a combination, but I think giving up those prize cards is still a big detriment to you. Even if you are throwing hand disruption on your opponent, it's not that big of a deal, and it's still going to be one of those archetypes that is really high maintenance as well. Definitely Toadscruel, where you need to have a full bench. You use your Fortress, then you have to turn attach to the thing you benched if you want to have full value as well with your Toadscruel EX, which is just not something that's all that easy to do. And it does give up prize cards. Yes, grass-type coverage is becoming more relevant, but I don't think to the point as to where Fortress is going to be a viable card. So maybe a little bit more experimentation, but I also think that this won't be for a long period of time and probably still that 1-star card. So is Wo-Chen EX the hot new tech card for Mirage Gate based builds wanting to have grass type coverage? Well, probably not, I think. This is still going to be too expensive of an attack cost for the most part. I think definitely the Forest Burn requiring 3 grass energy is too much to be thinking of this card as a tech inclusion in any way, shape or form. I think you're better off looking at the Shaman V-Stars, even just the Shaman V and the Leafeon V and V-Star combinations. I think these are going to be stronger than Wo-Chen, sneaking its way into deck lists as a grass-type tech attacker. I just don't think like these are the best option to go for. I still feel like this will be continuing to be a 1-star card, but it's just not worthwhile right now. Even with that grass-type coverage, there are better options that you could be playing. GUEX, obviously a 1-star. Skeleturge, also pretty obvious. Quaquavel, also fairly obvious. Bellybolt's pretty obvious. Slowking, yeah, pretty obvious. Annihilate, unfortunate, but yes, 1-star. Clodsire, 1-star. And the bulk Vs are the bulk Vs. So overall, I think we did pretty well on the EXs. Maybe got to tune down Ting Lu a little bit, possibly. Squawk a little bit, possibly. And Chen Pao a little bit, possibly. But overall, being pessimistic was the right way to go about this set. So it looks like Luxray was actually one of the biggest flops of Paldea Evolved from the rating. Some people giving this a 5-star. We were with the majority here and giving it a 4-star rating, thinking that it could have gone into a plethora of archetypes. Could have made its way into Lugia to help out the mirror match and against Palkia. Could have gone into certainly reversal builds of Gardevoir, but also just giving yourself that answer to Lugia in general. Could have found its way into the deck, and also could have found its way alongside Mirage Gate into Lost Box engines, where at the moment we were playing Raikou and Forest Hill Stone, but this actually gave you a single prize uptrade option. And I actually think the main hurdle for this archetype was just the lack of search in the deck. Lugia would have had to rely on coin flips to actually find the Luxray at the right time, even if you are putting the energy out of the deck, as in when you need it. Gardevoir only played 3 Ultra Balls and oftentimes had to commit them to the Gardevoirs themselves, and if you wanted to incorporate a Luxray package into Lost Box, you probably had to play Raihan to make that happen. And if you're Raihan searching the Luxray, it means you already had to have had the Gate plus Turn attachment handy just in the deck. So even though we saw a big uptick in Palkia Chen Pao as like a new budding archetype heading into the World Championships, and even though Lugia was the most popular archetype day 1 of the World Championships, Luxray didn't find its way into the archetype. Pretty surprising, and I don't think there's really much reason to still see a huge amount of Luxray going into the next set, because I don't think Palkia is that high of a priority, and I don't think Lugia is also that high of a priority to make it worth that tech inclusion. Possibly when 151 comes out, because I do think Lugia gets a lot stronger with the inclusion of Mew EX. That's in September. We could start looking at Luxray again, but that's something for the distant future. And right now I think we have to drop Luxray down probably all the way to a 2-star, where it saw experimentation early, but really didn't follow through in many decks. I think it saw a little bit of a showing alongside a Charizard Lost Box, but outside of that, it really didn't do too much else. We were pretty much right on the money with Spiritomb. It did make its way into Arceus decks. It made it into some Gardevoir decks. It had that minor upside of shutting down that kind of lazy ability from Slacking as well, so we knew from the very beginning, and that actually did end up being relevant and seeing play in a number of Arceus builds. So yeah, happy with this one. It seemed like the more splashable, easy tech card than a Drapion to help out against Mew, and I feel like it saw enough play at the NEIC and is certainly worth considering now post-Worlds, where Mew won the whole thing, of going back into deck lists, because people have to continue to respect Mew. It's just not going to go anywhere until we all decide to play 59 card decks and Spiritomb sits in that 60th sleeve. So the Wings of Union archetype, definitely a fun one. So a little bit more than experimentation, I suppose, with a number of pretty strong players choosing to play this at the NEIC, notably Alex Szymanski, who won the EUIC, then put his money on this deck of all things, trying to be a type coverage toolbox, which you can see in the bottom right of the screen was the selling point of the deck, hitting for some crucial weaknesses with your Wattrel and Murkrow, and just hoping that with early Squawk discards and with refinements throughout the game that you reach high enough damage output in the other matchups. You can see I've got a number of the things that ended up being in Szymanski's list just on the screen right now, so we had a pretty good idea of where the deck was going to go and what it was going to look like. So I think probably giving it that 3-star rating is fair, because it did have a bit of a highlight at the NEIC, but was basically unplayable for the World Championships, because pretty much people realized that A, there was going to be Urshifu possibly being around, which just also stomps this archetype, but also, like, even if you are dodging the Duras, dodging the Lost Boxes, the deck still had inconsistencies, wasn't necessarily the fastest, and could just lose to all sorts in the room. So yeah, it seemed like a fun archetype, had a real surprise showing at the NEIC that is worth a nod, but I don't think we're going to see much repeatability from this archetype. It actually seems pretty brave looking back now, giving this sort of card a 2-star rating, seeing as though Miltank was such a staple for a long time in a number of archetypes, and some were even defined by Miltank overall, and the Mimikyu covers more bases with EXs and V Pokemon, but the simple fact is the format is very much based around single and multi-prize Pokemon, so almost every archetype has a way around Mimikyu. The Charizard deck actually has trouble with Mimikyu. I think Charmeleon's the best way to get through this card, so maybe watch this space. Because you can definitely make the game a little bit weird for Charizard players at times if you want to incorporate this into your deck. It could also go into like Lost Box engines where you're forcing things like Charmanders into play for them to actually evolve into a Charmeleon, and then you give yourself Sableye plays as well. So it could be a really interesting card for that reason, and maybe could see a small uptick in play, but I think 2/1 star is probably the way to put it for the Paldea Evolved meta. It just wasn't a format to have a safeguard style card. Because of how Gardevoir traded, because of how Lost Box traded, it forced other archetypes to play a number of single prize Pokemon, which then made the Mimikyu pretty useless. Oricorio, yeah, also seemed to be hyped by a number of people, but yeah, didn't really have much of a home. Mismagius, also pretty poor. There wasn't really any like hand disruption or locky decks. I think even Sander at the World Championships basically played like a counter toolbox, and cards like this just sort of didn't have the space for an archetype that had to spread itself so thin to try and beating the wide field. Gothitelle, also pretty poor. Wigglytuff, yeah, pretty poor. Garganackle, bad. Glimora, also pretty poor. Grafaiai, unfortunately quite poor. It does now have the Letter of Encouragement, which might give you some encouragement in terms of testing this card, but still probably quite bad. Hydreigon, awful. Weavile, awful. Orthworm, awful. Dunsparce, yeah, pretty awful. And Pelipper, it's just not in the right format. Would have been good like 10 years ago. So yeah, that really rounds out the single prize Pokemon. Again, not too bad. I think a little bit of an overhyping of Luxray and possibly not respecting the Wings of Union enough, thinking that there was just enough people who loved Night March back in the day to pick up this archetype and give it a whirl, and possibly not respecting the type coverage enough that it gave the deck the higher damage output it needed. But again, it seemed like this archetype just had a number of interesting cards, but not necessarily ones that could make it immediately in the format. They're ones to keep an eye on and know about and have them in the binder here and there. Definitely that Mimikyu, we gave it a low rating just for this format, but who knows, as the format progresses, even with 1 or 2 new archetypes coming out, just having a 1-card answer that can instantly wall other decks then makes it quite viable, and Psychic Energy is actually one of the most playable energies, so you could consider it in Lost Box, you could consider it in Gardevoir, so definitely a card that we need to be monitoring based on which archetypes are brand new and coming out. So that really rounds out the Paldea Evolved set review. I am going to try and do some content for Obsidian Flames. We're a little bit late, obviously, because of the World Championships. Let me know down below if you'd prefer a full set review or if you'd like quite a condensed one, which only talks about kind of the best cards. Was also thinking about doing just a top 10 list or a top 20, something like that. So I'll hear your thoughts down below. If it does need to be one of the longer form full reviews, it's probably going to take some time. It might have to take maybe a week for me to prep everything, formulate our ideas, and obviously get the slides ready and all that stuff, and also get the community results as well. So I would really like your input down below what you would prefer to see. But that's it for today, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.